Good morning, Wyandotte. We have a new sermon series that we're beginning, and I want to start by reading a text out of Mark 13. It says in Mark 13 that as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Jesus replies, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when are these things going to happen? And what will be the sign that they're all about to be fulfilled?" Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These will be the beginning of the birth pains. You must be on your guard. You'll be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you'll also stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must be preached in all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand what you're going to say, but just say whatever is given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Then you will see the abomination that causes desolation, standing where it does not belong. Let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down and enter into the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it'll be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. But at that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Messiah,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I've told you everything ahead of time." Now, wow, this sounds like really scary stuff. I mean, what frightening things you can find in the Bible. But we live in scary times right now, too. And when we see pandemics globally shutting down, even destroying economies, countless hundreds of thousands of people dying, when you then on top of that have racial tensions and riots and cities being burned, it's kind of scary. And you look at the scariness of it all, you look how frightening it is, you think this must be the end of times. This must be what the Bible was talking about. This is surely the end. Well, we do live in very frightening times. It is frightening. It is a difficult time to even process what it all means, whether you're talking about the pandemic or whether you're talking about the racial tensions in America right now or any number of other problems. What does it mean, and how do we find our way out of this? And is there even a way out of this, or is this the beginning of the end? Well, the Bible has a word for you, and this word is not written to frighten you. Rather, it's meant to give us hope. You see, there's been lots of terrible times through history. In the history of the church, there has been really one after another, and you don't see very long seasons of peace. Most people suffer quite a bit in their lives. And most people live in times where there is mass suffering, whether it's wars or famines or any number of other kind of strife and persecution. That's a pretty common trait of the human condition. Well, the Bible speaks to that and wants us to be encouraged. And you think, wow, what you were just reading about Jesus, it didn't sound very encouraging. Well, actually, if you go back and look in this passage in Mark 13, as Jesus speaks to his disciples, he makes this comment that this incredible temple structure is eventually going to be destroyed. And they're just galled by that. They can't believe that something as magnificent as the temple could ever be torn down. And he says that it will, and they come back and they're like, man, so when's this going to happen, or how is it going to happen? Can you explain and like work this out for us? And he says some stuff that on the surface looks pretty scary. But as you look back at it, I want to point out that he's actually reassuring them. If you go back to verse 5, he says, watch out that no one deceives you. A couple verses later, he says, such things must happen. Verse 9, he says, you must be on your guard. Verse 11, do not worry beforehand. Verse 13, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Verse 14, let the reader understand. And then all the way down to verse 23, he repeats, so be on your guard. He's not trying to scare them. He's not trying to leave his followers unsettled. He's trying to confirm and give assurance in that yes, bad things are going to happen, but stand firm to the end. Yes, you need to brace yourself. You need to be on your guard. He says it twice, be on your guard. But don't think that just because bad things happen that God has lost control of the situation and that things have unraveled and fallen apart. Don't despair. God is still in control. And so he's saying these things to give assurance, to warn in advance about what bad things are going to come. And you see that throughout, like I said, Christian history. You see that all Christians can appreciate this message, because whatever century you may happen to have been born in, it's very likely that during your lifetime, you're going to have some pretty uncertain times where your life is in danger and things are frightening. But not only does he give assurance here, but this is styled in a type of literature that we find in the Bible. And you find all different types of literature in the Bible. You find poetry, you find historical narrative, you find teaching. There's all sorts of different structures and different types of literature. Just like out in the world, you would find everything from a news website where you expect to read, unbiased news, at least you'd hope to. But then you'd also turn around and read a novel, or you'd read poetry. And each different style of literature has its own set of expectations, kind of its own vocabulary, its own purposes. Well, this scripture in Mark 13 and other places, probably most famously in the book of Revelation, these scriptures speak to a different kind of audience, an audience that is being persecuted, an audience that lives in frightening times. And this type of literature is called apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature, or an apocalypse is not something to scare you. It's something to be revealed. It's being unveiled. It's being shown. It's being laid out like you didn't know how this was going to end, but don't worry, this is the part of the movie where we're going to tell you how it's going to pan out. And you can kind of rest easy. We're not going to hold you in suspense any longer. Now things will be revealed, and you can be assured, to simplify it, and maybe this is going too far. I've gone back and forth over the years about how I feel about summarizing the entire book of Revelation in one sentence, or passages like this in one sentence or one phrase. But in the end, God wins. And sometimes we need to hear that. When it seems like there's nothing but injustice, when there's nothing but people calling evil good and good evil, and everything seems upside down and backwards, we need to hear that God wins in the end. And that's what apocalyptic literature does. Apocalyptic literature says, now wait a second, yes, bad things are coming, and it's always written to a very specific group of people in a very specific time, but they're told, okay, yes, this immediate future is going to be really bad, but don't worry, God wins in the end. And so this isn't primarily about the end of the world. It's about the end that's coming up right away. It's about this terrible danger, this terrible threat that's happening right here and right now. You see this again and again in the Bible, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament. They're talking about those emergencies that happen right then. You say, no, wait a second. I'm just sure the book of Revelation is about the end of time. Well, it is sort of. All apocalyptic literature is kind of like the experience a lot of us have had as we've driven to Colorado. When you drive to Colorado, you get across the plains of western Kansas, and boy, there's just not much to see for a long time. But as you start to get into Colorado, you start to see on the horizon the mountains. And they start to come into focus, and you just see this wall emerge over the horizon of all of these mountains. As you get closer and closer, you start passing a few of the smaller ones. And as you finally start to approach Denver or Colorado Springs or whatever, finally those mountains are coming fully into view. But they all look like they're together because they're off still several miles away. If you keep driving and go through the mountains, suddenly those two mountain peaks that looked like they were side by side, now one of them is right next to you and the other one is still far away on the horizon. And you can go through the mountains and you can have mountains behind you on the horizon, all around you, and still further out, more mountains left to get to if you just keep driving and keep driving toward the horizon. Apocalyptic literature works a lot of the same way. When Jesus is speaking to his disciples, or John is writing in the book of Revelation, or Daniel back in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, when you read that, a lot of times you are talking about that first mountain that's coming up right away, and the instructions are specifically for the people right there, right then, about that next mountain. But it's kind of looking past to the other mountains too. And a lot of what is said is often applicable to what is coming down later down the road. And so when we read this, you can go back to the original passages, like where it says in verse 14, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong. Okay, well, what does that mean? He says, let the reader understand. And the parallel passage in Matthew, he specifically says, by the way, this is in Daniel. When you go back to Daniel chapter 11, you see that same phrase. And it's talking about a mountain of persecution that's right in front of them. In this case, it's the Greek-run Syrians, led by a terrible, terrible person called Antiochus Epiphanes. And he's going to come into Jerusalem. He's going to stop the worship at the temple. He's going to set up false idols and murder people. It's going to be really, really, really bad. And in that case, the people are told in Daniel chapter 11, he says, the ones who understand, the ones who are on God's side, they're going to resist. And it turns out, sometime after Daniel writes that, this all comes to pass. The people do resist and they fight back. But you come to this period now in the 1st century AD where Jesus is talking to his disciples. We're not talking about the Syrians coming down into Jerusalem now. Now we're talking about the Roman Empire. And so now you have a different set of circumstances. Now there's a mountain behind you and there's a mountain right next to you, and this new mountain is Rome. This is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be the same kind of thing. The outsiders are going to come in and stop worship at the temple. But this time it's going to be way worse. Jesus started this passage out saying, you're not going to believe it, but these stones are not going to be left on top of each other. And sure enough, the Romans are going to destroy the temple about 35 years after Jesus. And so he says this, and just, within that next generation, the temple gets destroyed. This is a warning, to the Christians who hear this, that first generation of believers. Some of that terrible persecution that's going to happen in their lifetime is going to come from the Roman Empire. And the instructions there, instead of resisting like what you read in Daniel, the instructions here are that they should run away. That sometimes when the church is persecuted, it pushes back, and sometimes it needs to flee. And it's going to be especially bad with the Romans. In fact, it would be hard to say that any persecution is ever going to rival this, not only in the number of the Jewish people that they're going to kill, the number of Christians that they're going to kill, but they destroy the temple. The temple that was built up, the temple that Jesus was at, that temple gets destroyed, and in 2,000 years, it's never been rebuilt. In fact, there's a Muslim mosque that sits where that temple used to be now. There's no Jewish temple there. All they have are basically the foundation stones underneath all of those magnificent buildings that used to be there. And so he's warning them that this next one, in this apocalyptic literature, you got to watch out. In this case, you're going to want to run away. You're going to feel sorry for anybody who's slowed down, because there's no time to run back and grab your coat or go back into the house to get what you need. You just need to run away. It's going to be really, really bad. But stand firm to the end. But God wins in the end. And so we look forward down the road. What's going to happen? What's going to happen now? This has been 2,000 years. Does this apply to us? Well, it specifically applied to the first century Christians. But in principle, it applies. I don't know if we'll ever see any persecution as severe as the Roman Empire. But even with the persecution that we do have, as we see our society go from one that's predominantly Christian, where everybody was kind of culturally Christian maybe 50 years ago, to now where Christianity is very distinctly a minority and seems to be shrinking, or at least it appears to be the case in some places. That kind of persecution, what's the message to us? God is going to win in the end. God is going to prevail. Stand firm, be on your guard. Understand that bad things are going to happen. There's going to be injustice that you see in your lifetime, and you may directly suffer under it. You're never promised that you won't suffer as a Christian. But stand firm. God is going to win in the end. This is what we're hoping for. This is what we're longing for. In times when Christianity has been dominant, a lot of these apocalyptic passages, the reading of the book of Revelation and such, it's kind of been one of those things that kind of steer toward like people who like conspiracy theories. They like secret knowledge, and they wanna know like some Bible code that's gonna tell them the future. This is a message to those who are being persecuted. And maybe now, more than 50 years ago, we can begin to appreciate and understand what apocalyptic literature says and what it means for us. In fact, we were going to spend the next several weeks talking about, what does apocalyptic literature look like? What does it mean? How should we read it? And how do we apply this message of confidence and reassurance to the situation that we find ourselves in right now? May God bless you.